What if I told you that while the royal family slept safely in their palaces, Princess Diana was sneaking through the dark streets of London to feed the homeless? What if the most powerful woman in Britain regularly broke every security protocol to sit with drug addicts, prostitutes, and society's forgotten people? Tonight, I'm revealing the secret mission that Princess Diana risked her life for every single week, a mission so dangerous that she had to change cars multiple times to avoid being followed, so compassionate that it transformed the lives of hundreds of forgotten souls, and so revolutionary that it redefined what it meant to be royal. This isn't just another charity story. This is the story of a princess who chose the streets over the palace, who chose love over luxury, and who proved that true nobility isn't about crowns and titles. It's about seeing the humanity in people that society has thrown away. If Princess Diana's secret acts of courage inspire you to see the homeless differently, to treat forgotten people with dignity, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because her legacy isn't just about what she did, it's about what we can all do when we choose compassion over comfort. London, winter 1994, 11:30 p.m. The black sedan pulled up to a nondescript warehouse in one of London's grittiest neighborhoods, far from the glittering world of Kensington Palace. Inside the car, a woman adjusted her baseball cap and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. To anyone watching, she looked like just another social worker arriving for a late shift. But this was no ordinary volunteer. This was Diana, Princess of Wales, and she was about to begin one of the most dangerous and compassionate missions of her life. My name is Diana, and what I'm about to tell you will shatter everything you think you know about royal duty. For the past 6 months, I have been living a double life that would have horrified the palace officials and transformed how the world saw the British royal family forever. The building in front of me housed a charity called Off the Streets, a shelter that provided refuge for London's most forgotten people, prostitutes, drug addicts, alcoholics, and anyone else that society had given up on. This wasn't the kind of place that appeared on royal calendars or earned positive press coverage. This was the kind of place that most people, including most royals, pretended didn't exist. But I couldn't pretend anymore. It had started 3 months earlier when I was driving back to Kensington Palace after an official engagement. At a red light near Westminster, I noticed a young man huddled in a doorway, shivering in the December cold. Something about his face reminded me of William, the same age, the same vulnerable expression, but living in a world so different it might as well have been another planet. Instead of driving past like my security team wanted me to, I had asked my driver to stop. Against every protocol, I got out of the car and approached the young man. His name was Vincent Seabrook, and he was 23 years old, the same age I had been when I became Princess of Wales. "Are you hungry?" I asked him, pulling sandwiches from my purse that I had saved from the reception. Vincent looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. He recognized me, of course. My face was on every newspaper and magazine in Britain. But he couldn't quite believe that the Princess of Wales was standing in front of him, offering him food in a dirty London doorway. "You're her," he said quietly. "You're the princess." "I'm Diana," I replied, sitting down beside him on the cold pavement, much to my security team's horror. "And you're Vincent. Tell me how you ended up here." For the next hour, I sat on that dirty street corner and listened to Vincent's story. He had aged out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go and no family to support him. He had tried to find work, but without an address, most employers wouldn't even consider him. He had been sleeping rough for 2 years, surviving on handouts and the occasional meal from charities. But what broke my heart wasn't just his circumstances. It was how surprised he was that someone, anyone, was willing to listen to his story with genuine interest and compassion. "People look right through us," he told me. "Like we're invisible. Like we don't count as real people anymore." That night, I gave Vincent my personal phone number, something that would have given my security team heart attacks if they had known. I also gave him the number for Centrepoint, a homeless charity I supported, and promised to follow up to make sure he got help. But Vincent's words haunted me. "People look right through us." I realized that despite all my charity work, despite all the royal visits and fundraising galas, I had been looking through them too. I had been helping homelessness as an abstract concept, not homeless people as individual human beings with names and stories and dreams. That's when I decided to start my secret mission. Paul George, the social worker who ran Off the Streets, had been skeptical when I first contacted him about visiting. The shelter served 40 of London's most vulnerable people on any given night: sex workers trying to get off the streets, addicts struggling with withdrawal, mentally ill individuals who had nowhere else to go. "Your Royal Highness," he had said carefully during our first phone conversation, "this isn't like your other charity visits. These aren't children in clean hospital beds or polite elderly people at garden parties. Some of our clients are hostile to authority figures. Some are unpredictable. Many have had terrible experiences with the police and social services." "That's exactly why I need to come," I had told him. "If they've been failed by everyone else, maybe it's time the monarchy tried a different approach." Now, 3 months later, I was about to walk into that warehouse for what had become my weekly ritual. Every Tuesday night, I would slip away from Kensington Palace using elaborate security procedures that involved changing cars twice to throw off any photographers or reporters who might be following me. I wore no jewelry, no makeup, no indication of my royal status. I dressed in jeans, trainers, and casual jackets, clothes that would allow me to blend in with the volunteers and, more importantly, with the people we were serving. As I approached the entrance to Off the Streets, I could hear voices inside, some laughing, some arguing, all of them representing lives that had been pushed to the margins of society. In a few minutes, I would be sitting with them, serving them food, listening to their stories, and treating them with the dignity that the rest of the world had denied them. But first, I had to prepare myself for what Paul George had warned me about during my first visit. Not everyone would be happy to see me. Some would be suspicious of my motives. Others would be openly hostile to what I represented. As I reached for the door handle, I thought about Vincent, who was now safely housed thanks to Centrepoint and had found work as a security guard. He had sent me a letter just last week, thanking me for treating him like a human being when everyone else had treated him like a problem to be ignored. Tonight, there would be 40 more Vincents inside that warehouse. 40 more people who had been made invisible by society's indifference. 40 more opportunities to prove that everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. What I didn't know was that one of those 40 people was about to teach me a lesson about forgiveness, humanity, and the transformative power of remembering someone's name that would change how I understood my role as a princess forever. Inside the off-the-street shelter, 11:45 p.m. The warehouse was filled with the sound of conversations, the clatter of dishes, and the underlying tension that always existed when 40 people who had nowhere else to go were gathered in one space. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces that told stories of hardship, addiction, and survival. The air smelled of instant coffee, disinfectant, and the kind of desperation that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Paul George met me at the entrance, his face showing the same mixture of gratitude and anxiety that I had come to recognize in the staff who worked with society's most vulnerable people. They appreciated my visits, but they also knew that my presence could change the dynamic in unpredictable ways. "How are they tonight?" I asked, pulling on the plastic gloves that volunteers used when serving food. "Mixed group," Paul replied quietly. "We've got some regulars who are excited to see you, but there's also some new people who, well, let's just say they're not fans of the establishment." As we walked deeper into the warehouse, I could see the familiar setup that had become as familiar to me as any royal event. Folding tables arranged in rows, plastic chairs that had seen better days, a makeshift kitchen where volunteers ladled soup and sandwiches onto paper plates. But unlike royal events, there was no ceremony here, no protocol, no pretense. Just human beings trying to survive another night. I had learned during my previous visits that the key to connecting with the people here was to approach them as individuals, not as a group. Each person had a story, a name, a reason for being here that went far beyond the simple label of homeless. There was Margaret, the 60-year-old woman who had lost her council flat after her husband died and she couldn't afford the rent alone. There was Tommy, the young man with schizophrenia whose family couldn't cope with his illness. There was Sarah, the teenager who had aged out of foster care and had nowhere else to go. And then there was Ricky. I noticed him immediately when I walked into the main area, a swaggering 23-year-old with angry eyes and defensive body language that screamed hostility. He was holding court with a small group of newer residents, and I could hear fragments of his conversation as I moved around the room serving food. "Don't know why they bother coming here," he was saying, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Probably just taking pictures for the newspapers. Make themselves feel good about helping the poor people." Paul George moved closer to me, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's Ricky. He's been on the streets for 5 years, since he was 18. Very angry, very distrustful of authority. He's been here for 3 nights, and he's been... Paul paused, searching for diplomatic words. He's been expressing some strong opinions about the royal family. I nodded, understanding the warning but not letting it deter me. Anger, I had learned, was often just pain wearing a different mask. And if Ricky was angry at people like me, he probably had good reasons. As I continued serving food and talking with the regular clients, I could hear Ricky's voice getting louder and more belligerent. He was clearly performing for his audience, using his hostility toward authority figures as a way to establish his credibility with the group. "I don't know about these royals," he said, his voice now loud enough that everyone in the warehouse could hear. "Living in their palaces while people sleep in doorways. I think the IRA should shoot them all. She comes in here, we can give her a good one." The room went quiet. Even in a shelter for society's most marginalized people, there were lines that most people didn't cross, and threatening violence against someone who was volunteering her time was one of them. Paul George started moving toward Ricky, clearly preparing to intervene before the situation escalated. But something about Ricky's face stopped me. Underneath the anger and bravado, I could see something familiar, the same desperate need for recognition that I had seen in Vincent's eyes that night in the doorway. Ricky wasn't just angry at the royal family, he was angry at a world that had made him invisible. Instead of letting Paul handle the situation, I walked directly toward Ricky. The conversations around us stopped as people watched to see what would happen when the Princess of Wales confronted someone who had just threatened her life. Paul George was beside me now, his hand hovering near his radio to call security if needed. "Diana," he whispered urgently, "maybe we should." But I was already standing in front of Ricky, looking directly into his eyes with the same expression I used when talking to William and Harry when they were upset about something. Not angry, not afraid, just genuinely interested in understanding what was really going on. "It's Ricky, isn't it?" I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the silent warehouse. "Didn't I meet you when you were sleeping down in the Strand?" The transformation was instantaneous and heartbreaking. The anger drained from Ricky's face, replaced by shock, confusion, and something that looked like hope. His aggressive posture melted away as he stared at me in disbelief. "That's right," he said, his voice suddenly small and vulnerable. You remember me?" The truth was, I had never met Ricky before that night. But I had met dozens of young men just like him during my secret visits to doorways and under bridges around London. I had seen the same look in their eyes, heard the same stories of rejection and abandonment, witnessed the same desperate need to be acknowledged as human beings worthy of respect. More importantly, I understood what Ricky needed in that moment. He needed to know that someone saw him, remembered him, valued him enough to recognize him when they met again. He needed to know that he mattered. "Of course I remember you," I said, sitting down in the plastic chair next to him, ignoring the stunned silence of everyone around us. "How are you doing? Are you getting yourself together?" "I'm trying," Ricky said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "It's hard, you know. Everyone looks at you like you're nothing. Like you're just garbage that someone forgot to pick up." "You're not garbage, Ricky," I said firmly. "You're a human being with value and dignity, regardless of your circumstances. And anyone who treats you otherwise is wrong." What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments of my life. This young man who had been threatening violence against me just minutes earlier began to cry, not from shame or self-pity, but from relief. Relief that someone had seen him, recognized him, treated him as a person worthy of respect and compassion. Around us, the other residents of the shelter watched in amazement as the angry, hostile young man transformed into someone vulnerable and hopeful. But more than that, they were watching a princess prove that the distance between a palace and a homeless shelter wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in willingness to see other people as fully human. As I sat with Ricky for the next hour, listening to his story and helping him think through his options for getting off the streets, I realized that this was why I had started these secret missions. Not to feel good about myself, not to earn positive publicity, but to bridge the gap between the world I lived in and the world that society preferred to ignore. But what I didn't know was that my conversation with Ricky was about to lead to something even more extraordinary. A revelation about the power of consistency, the importance of showing up, and the way that genuine relationships could form in the most unlikely places. Off the streets shelter, 1:15 a.m. As the evening wore on, I found myself moving naturally between the residents, each conversation revealing another layer of the complex web of circumstances that had brought these people to this place. What struck me most wasn't their differences, but their similarities, the common thread of abandonment, rejection, and society's systematic failure to see them as individuals worthy of care and respect. Margaret, the 60-year-old woman I had met on previous visits, approached me as I was helping clear tables. She had been coming to the shelter for 2 months since losing her flat, and her story had become painfully familiar to me. "Diana, love," she said quietly, using the informal address that would have horrified palace protocol officers, "I wanted to thank you for last week. What you said about my Albert. It meant everything." I remembered the conversation she was referring to. Margaret had been crying as she told me about her husband Albert, who had died 6 months earlier after 47 years of marriage. She had been consumed with guilt, convinced that she had failed him by not being able to keep their home after his death. "You didn't fail Albert," I had told her then. "You loved him for 47 years, and love like that doesn't end just because circumstances become difficult. He would be proud of how strong you're being." Now, seeing Margaret's face light up as she remembered those words, I understood something crucial about what these visits really meant. It wasn't just about the food or the shelter, it was about the radical act of treating people with dignity when the rest of the world had written them off. But my moment of reflection was interrupted by Paul George approaching with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Diana," he said, glancing around to make sure we couldn't be overheard, "something extraordinary has happened. Ricky wants to speak with you privately. But more than that, he wants to bring his friend Marcus." I looked across the room to where Ricky was sitting with a thin, nervous-looking young man I hadn't seen before. Marcus appeared to be around Ricky's age, but where Ricky projected anger and defiance, Marcus seemed to radiate fear and shame. "Marcus has been sleeping rough for 8 months, Paul continued. "He's HIV positive, and he's convinced that he's going to die alone and forgotten. He won't talk to counselors, won't access medical services, won't trust anyone in authority. But Ricky told him about your conversation tonight, and for the first time since I've known him, Marcus wants to talk to someone." The significance of this moment wasn't lost on me. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, HIV/AIDS carried a stigma so powerful that many people literally preferred to die rather than seek help. The combination of homelessness and HIV was often a death sentence, not because the disease was necessarily fatal, but because society treated people with HIV as if they were already dead. I had worked extensively with AIDS patients through my official charity work, but those visits had been in clean hospital wards with medical staff present and photographers documenting my compassionate interactions. This was different. This was 2 frightened young men in a homeless shelter at 1 a.m., with no cameras, no protocol officers, and no safety net beyond my willingness to sit with them and listen. "Of course I'll talk with them," I told Paul. "Where can we have some privacy?" Paul led me to a small office at the back of the warehouse, a cramped space with a desk, 3 chairs, and walls covered with resource information and support group flyers. A few minutes later, Ricky and Marcus joined us, both looking nervous but determined. Marcus was painfully thin, with a hollowed-out look that I had learned to recognize in people who weren't just homeless but actively dying. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and he had the persistent cough that often accompanied advanced HIV infection in an era before effective treatments were widely available. "Marcus," I said gently, extending my hand for him to shake, "Ricky tells me you've been having a tough time. Thank you for trusting me enough to talk." The simple act of shaking his hand, something that would seem unremarkable today, was revolutionary in 1994. Public figures, including many medical professionals, still wore gloves when interacting with HIV-positive patients. The fact that a member of the royal family was willing to have direct physical contact with someone who was HIV-positive and homeless sent a message that was impossible to ignore. Marcus stared at our joined hands for a moment, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. "You're not afraid of me," he whispered. "Why would I be afraid of you?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because I'm dying," he said simply. "Because I'm sick and I'm homeless and I'm everything that people are supposed to stay away from." I kept holding his hand as I responded, making sure he could feel the reality of human connection that had been denied to him for so long. "Marcus, you're not everything people are supposed to stay away from. You're a human being who deserves love, care, and respect, regardless of your health status or housing situation. The people who taught you to be afraid of yourself were wrong." What followed was one of the most honest conversations about fear, shame, and hope that I had ever experienced. Marcus told me about his diagnosis, about the way his family had rejected him, about sleeping in doorways and believing that he was going to die alone and unmourned. But he also told me about his dreams. Before he became homeless, he had been studying to be a teacher. He loved working with children and had hoped to make a difference in young people's lives. Even now, sick and scared and living on the streets, he still harbored hope that somehow he might find a way back to that dream. "I know it's stupid," he said, his voice barely audible. "Who's going to hire someone like me to work with children? I'm everything parents are supposed to protect their kids from." "It's not stupid," I told him firmly. "And you're not everything parents are supposed to protect their children from. You're someone who understands what it means to struggle, what it means to be rejected, what it means to need compassion. Those are exactly the qualities that would make you an extraordinary teacher." Ricky, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "She's right, mate. Look how she's talking to us. Like we're real people, not just problems to be solved. That's what you used to be like with the kids in your neighborhood, before everything went wrong." I looked at these two young men, one dying of AIDS, one consumed with anger at the world that had failed him, and realized that they were teaching me something profound about the difference between charity and justice. Charity was what I did during my official visits, dispensing comfort and resources to grateful recipients. Justice was what was happening in this cramped office at 1:30 in the morning, the radical act of treating people as equals, listening to their dreams as well as their problems, and refusing to accept that anyone should be written off as disposable. But as our conversation continued, I had no idea that this night was about to take an even more dramatic turn. Because Marcus was about to ask me something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the limitations of my role as a princess, and force me to make a decision that could either save a life or destroy my reputation forever. Still in the office, 2:30 a.m. As our conversation deepened, I could see Marcus beginning to relax in a way that suggested he hadn't felt safe with another human being in months. The fear and shame that had dominated his expression when he first sat down were gradually being replaced by something I had learned to recognize during my visits with terminally ill patients. Not false hope, but the genuine relief that comes from being fully seen and accepted. Ricky, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. The angry young man who had threatened violence against the royal family 3 hours earlier was now protective of his friend, proud to be facilitating a conversation that was clearly meaningful to both of us. "Marcus has been looking after me since I got here," Ricky explained. "He's the one who convinced me to stay at the shelter instead of going back to the streets. He's been like a big brother, you know." "Is that right?" I asked Marcus, who blushed at the praise. "Ricky's been having a rough time," Marcus said quietly. "He's angry at everyone, but underneath all that anger, he's just scared. Same as all of us." It was a remarkably perceptive observation from someone who was dealing with his own overwhelming challenges. I was beginning to understand that the relationship between these two young men represented something that the outside world rarely saw, the way that people who had been discarded by society often found ways to care for each other with a depth and loyalty that put many traditional families to shame. "Marcus," I said gently, "Ricky told me about your teaching background. Have you thought about what it would take to get back to that? Not immediately, but as a long-term goal." Marcus looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. Whether from emotion, illness, or withdrawal from substances, I couldn't tell. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "But there's so much. I mean, I'd need to get healthy, find housing, get back into school, pass background checks. And even if I could do all that, who's going to hire someone who's been homeless and has HIV? "One step at a time," I said. "What would be the first step?" "Getting medical care," he said immediately. "I haven't seen a doctor since I was diagnosed 8 months ago. I'm scared to find out how bad things have gotten." This was where the conversation took a turn that would test every boundary I had established for my secret charity work. Because what Marcus said next wasn't a request for money or resources. It was a request for something far more dangerous and far more meaningful. "Diana," he said, his voice becoming stronger and more direct than it had been all evening, Would you come with me? To the clinic? I know it's a lot to ask, and I know you probably can't, but I've been trying to work up the courage to go for months, and I don't think I can do it alone." The room fell silent. Ricky stared at his friend in amazement, clearly shocked by the boldness of the request. Paul George, who had been quietly observing our conversation from the corner, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. I understood immediately why everyone was so stunned. What Marcus was asking went far beyond the boundaries of traditional royal charity work. He wasn't asking me to write a check or make a phone call or even visit him in a controlled environment with medical staff and security personnel present. He was asking me to accompany him to a public clinic, where we would have no control over who else was there, what the conditions would be like, or how the media might react if our presence was discovered. More than that, he was asking me to be present for what might be devastating news about his health. This wasn't a photo opportunity or a carefully managed royal engagement. This was a request for genuine friendship and support during one of the most frightening moments of his life. Paul George cleared his throat nervously. "Marcus," he said gently, "I think you should understand that the princess has security concerns and official obligations that make it very difficult for her to—" "It's okay," Marcus interrupted, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I understand. It was stupid to ask. I just thought. I don't know what I thought." But I was already reaching into my purse for my private calendar, my mind racing through the logistics of what Marcus was asking and the potential consequences of saying yes. If I agreed to accompany Marcus to a medical appointment, I would be breaking nearly every protocol that governed royal behavior. I would be putting myself in an uncontrolled public situation with someone who was homeless and HIV positive, with no advanced security arrangements and no official purpose beyond personal friendship. If photographers discovered us, the images could be used to suggest that I was reckless with my safety, that I was exploiting vulnerable people for publicity, or that I was overstepping the bounds of appropriate royal involvement in social issues. If Marcus received bad news about his health, I would be witnessing and supporting him through a deeply private medical crisis that had nothing to do with my official duties as Princess of Wales. But as I looked at Marcus's face, the fear, the hope, the desperate need for someone to stand with him during a moment when he felt most alone, I realized that all of those concerns missed the point entirely. Marcus wasn't asking Princess Diana to accompany him to a medical appointment. He was asking his friend Diana to be present during one of the scariest moments of his life. And when someone you care about asks for that kind of support, protocols and security concerns and media considerations become irrelevant. "When do you want to go?" I asked simply. Marcus stared at me in disbelief. You'll really come with me?" "Of course I will," I said. "That's what friends do for each other." Ricky let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "You're actually going to do it." Paul George looked like he was about to faint, but he also looked impressed. "Diana," he said carefully, "are you sure about this? The clinic Marcus needs to visit. It's not exactly a controlled environment. It's a public NHS facility in South London that serves a lot of people with complex needs." "Which clinic?" I asked. "Camberwell Sexual Health Center," Marcus said quietly. "They have HIV specialists, and they take patients without appointments if you're willing to wait." I wrote the information in my calendar, already planning how I could make this work without creating a security nightmare for everyone involved. "What day works for you?" I asked Marcus. "Any day," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Any day you can spare." "Thursday afternoon," I said decisively. "I'll pick you up at 2 p.m. Paul, can you make sure Marcus has somewhere to stay until then?" Paul nodded, still looking stunned by what he was witnessing. As we prepared to end our conversation, Marcus reached out and hugged me, a spontaneous gesture that broke every rule of royal protocol but felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you," he whispered in my ear. "Not just for this, but for treating me like I matter." "You do matter," I whispered back. "More than you know." But as I prepared to leave the shelter that night, I had no idea that my decision to accompany Marcus to his medical appointment would set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform his life, but challenge everything I thought I knew about the power of showing up for people when they need it most. Camberwell Sexual Health Center, Thursday, 2:15 p.m. I arrived at the clinic in an unmarked car, wearing jeans, a simple sweater, and sunglasses, the same anonymous outfit I used for all my secret charity work. Marcus was waiting outside the building, pacing nervously and checking his watch every few seconds. When he saw me, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if he hadn't quite believed I would actually show up. "You came," he said simply. "I said I would," I replied, taking his arm as we walked toward the entrance. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted. "But better than I was yesterday." The Camberwell Sexual Health Center was exactly what Paul George had warned me about, a busy NHS facility that served a diverse population including sex workers, drug users, homeless individuals, and anyone else seeking confidential sexual health services. The waiting room was crowded, somewhat chaotic, and filled with people who had every reason to be suspicious of anyone who looked like they might be connected to authority. As we approached the reception desk, I could feel other patients glancing at us curiously. A few seemed to recognize me despite my attempts at disguise, but in this setting, my presence raised questions rather than excitement. What was Princess Diana doing in a sexual health clinic in South London? "I'm here for an appointment," Marcus told the receptionist, his voice barely audible with nerves. "HIV testing and consultation?" the receptionist asked matter-of-factly, checking her computer screen. "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "It's about a 2-hour wait," she said. "Are you prepared to stay that long?" Marcus looked at me uncertainly, clearly worried that I hadn't planned for such a long commitment. "We'll wait," I said firmly. "However long it takes." What followed were 2 of the most eye-opening hours of my life. Sitting in that waiting room, I was confronted with the reality of how Britain's most vulnerable people experienced healthcare, not as a right or a service, but as a privilege that had to be earned through patience, persistence, and the willingness to accept whatever conditions were offered. The other patients included a teenage girl who couldn't have been older than 16, a middle-aged man with obvious signs of drug withdrawal, several sex workers still wearing makeup from the previous night's work, and various other individuals whose stories I could only guess at. What struck me wasn't their differences, but the common thread of anxiety and vulnerability that connected everyone in that room. As we waited, Marcus and I talked quietly about his life before homelessness, his fears about the test results, and his dreams for the future. But I also found myself having conversations with other patients, not as Princess Diana making official visits, but as someone who was simply present in a space where people were dealing with some of the most frightening moments of their lives. The teenage girl, whose name was Sophie, was there for pregnancy testing and STI screening after aging out of foster care and turning to sex work for survival. The middle-aged man, David, was dealing with complications from injection drug use and hadn't seen a healthcare provider in 3 years. Each conversation reinforced what I had learned during my secret charity work, that behind every statistic about homelessness, addiction, or sexual health was a human being with a story, a name, and a desperate need to be treated with dignity. When Marcus's name was finally called, he squeezed my hand tightly. Can you come in with me?" he asked. "If you want me to, and if the doctor agrees," I said. The HIV specialist, Dr. Sarah Chen, was a woman about my age who clearly recognized me but maintained perfect professional composure. After Marcus explained that I was there for emotional support, she welcomed me into the consultation room without comment or fanfare. What followed was a thorough medical consultation that covered not just Marcus's HIV status, but his overall health, housing situation, and support systems. Dr. Chen's approach was exactly what Marcus needed: clinical but compassionate, thorough but not overwhelming, honest about challenges while emphasizing possibilities for treatment and support. The test results, when they came back, confirmed what Marcus had feared but also revealed something hopeful. While his HIV infection had progressed, it wasn't as advanced as his symptoms had suggested. More importantly, new treatment protocols were becoming available that could significantly improve both his health outcomes and his quality of life. "The most important thing now," Dr. Chen explained, "is getting you stable housing and consistent access to medical care. The medications we can offer you are very effective, but they require a stable routine and regular monitoring." This was where my presence in the room became more than just emotional support. Because Dr. Chen's main concern, stable housing, was something I actually had the power to help with through my connections with homeless charities and housing organizations. "What if we could guarantee stable housing?" I asked. "What would be the next steps for treatment?" Dr. Chen looked at me with new interest. If Marcus had stable housing, we could start antiretroviral therapy within the week. With his current viral load and CD4 count, I would expect to see significant improvement within 3 months. The transformation in Marcus's face was immediate and profound. For the first time since I had met him, he looked like someone who believed he had a future worth fighting for. "Really?" he whispered. "You think I could get better?" "I think you can get much better," Dr. Chen said firmly. HIV is no longer the death sentence it was 10 years ago. With proper treatment and support, there's no reason you can't live a long, healthy, productive life. As we left the clinic that day, Marcus was carrying a folder full of information about treatment options, support services, and follow-up appointments. But more importantly, he was carrying something I hadn't seen in him before: hope. "Diana," he said as we walked to my car, "I don't know how to thank you. Not just for today, but for seeing me as worth saving." "Marcus," I replied, "you were always worth saving. You just needed someone to remind you of that." But what neither of us knew was that our trip to the clinic had been photographed by a freelance photographer who had been following tips about my unusual activities. By the next morning, images of Princess Diana entering a sexual health clinic with a young homeless man would be splashed across every tabloid in Britain, creating a scandal that would force me to defend not just my actions, but my entire approach to charity work. The headlines would be brutal: "Diana's Secret Shame," and "Princess of Scandal," and "What was Diana really doing?" But they would also spark a conversation about homelessness, HIV stigma, and the role of public figures in addressing society's most challenging problems that would continue long after the initial controversy died down. More importantly, they would force me to articulate something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to express: that real compassion isn't about maintaining appropriate boundaries or following protocols. Real compassion is about showing up for people when they need you most, regardless of the personal cost. Kensington Palace, 6 months later. The controversy had been brutal but brief. The tabloids had sensationalized my clinic visit for exactly 3 days before moving on to other scandals. The palace had issued a statement about my continued commitment to supporting vulnerable populations through established charitable channels, which was diplomatic code for "please don't do that again." But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the letters that had poured into Kensington Palace from across Britain and around the world. Hundreds of people wrote to thank me for demonstrating that HIV-positive individuals deserved compassion rather than fear. Dozens of homeless individuals reached out to share their own stories of invisibility and abandonment. Medical professionals praised the attention brought to sexual health services for vulnerable populations. Most importantly, I received updates on the people whose lives had been touched by that one night at the off-the-streets shelter. Marcus had been housed through Centrepoint within a week of our clinic visit. His HIV treatment was progressing better than Dr. Chen had predicted, and he had enrolled in a teacher training program specifically designed for people with non-traditional backgrounds. He still faced challenges. The stigma around both homelessness and HIV didn't disappear overnight, but he now had the support system and medical care he needed to build the life he had dreamed of. Ricky had left the streets as well, inspired partly by watching his friend's transformation and partly by his own realization that his anger at the world was destroying his chances for a better future. He had entered a residential treatment program for drug addiction and was working toward reconnecting with family members he had alienated during his years on the streets. Vincent Seabrook, the young man I had met in the doorway months earlier, had not only maintained his housing and employment but had become a volunteer at Centrepoint, using his own experience of homelessness to help others navigate the system. But perhaps the most significant change was in the approach that other members of the royal family began taking toward charity work. William and Harry, inspired by the stories I shared with them about my secret missions, had started asking more questions about the real lives of the people we were supposed to be helping. They began requesting visits to homeless shelters, drug treatment centers, and other facilities that weren't typically included in royal engagements. "Mummy," William had said during one of our conversations about homelessness, "why don't we do more visits like the ones you do? The real ones, where people can talk to us like normal people." "Because," I had explained, "the palace believes that maintaining dignity and distance is more important than creating genuine connections. But I think they're wrong about that." The truth was that my secret charity work had taught me something fundamental about the difference between being royal and being useful. Being royal meant maintaining protocols, following schedules, and participating in carefully managed events that generated positive publicity. Being useful meant showing up for people when they needed support, listening to their stories without judgment, and treating them as equals regardless of their circumstances. The off-the-streets shelter had become a regular stop on my weekly rounds, but it was no longer secret. After the clinic controversy, I had decided to be more open about my unconventional charity work. The palace wasn't thrilled, but public support for my approach had been overwhelming enough that they couldn't object too strenuously. Paul George had told me that the number of people seeking help at the shelter had doubled since word spread about my regular visits. But more importantly, the quality of those interactions had changed. People came not just for food and shelter, but because they had heard that off the streets was a place where their stories would be heard and their dignity would be respected. "You've changed how people think about homelessness," Paul had told me during a recent visit. "Not just the public, but the homeless people themselves. They're starting to believe that they deserve better treatment, and that's making them more willing to accept help." It was an observation that made me realize something crucial about the nature of social change. Real transformation didn't happen through policy changes or funding increases, though those things were important. Real transformation happened when people who had been made invisible by society were reminded that they were visible, valuable, and deserving of respect. My secret mission to feed the homeless had started as a personal need to connect with people beyond the artificial boundaries of royal protocol. But it had evolved into something much more significant, a demonstration that the most powerful thing any of us can do is see other people as fully human and treat them accordingly. 3 years later, when I walked through that minefield in Angola to bring attention to the landmine crisis, reporters would note that my willingness to take personal risks for humanitarian causes had become a defining characteristic of my public work. They were right, but they had the timeline wrong. My willingness to take risks for humanitarian causes hadn't started in Angola. It had started on a cold London street corner with a homeless young man named Vincent, and it had been confirmed in a crowded NHS clinic with a dying young man named Marcus. The lesson I learned during those secret missions was simple but revolutionary. Everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued, regardless of their circumstances. When we treat people with genuine dignity and respect, we don't just change their lives, we change our own understanding of what it means to be human. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we change the world's understanding too. Princess Diana's secret missions to feed the homeless didn't just provide meals to hungry people, they provided something far more precious, the radical gift of being seen as fully human. In a world that had written off society's most vulnerable people as problems to be managed rather than individuals to be valued, Diana offered something revolutionary. Genuine friendship, unconditional respect, and the simple but powerful message that everyone matters. Her willingness to break royal protocol, to risk her safety, and to endure public criticism for the sake of homeless individuals like Vincent, Marcus, and Ricky demonstrates a truth that transcends royal titles and celebrity status. Real compassion isn't about maintaining appropriate boundaries or following social conventions. Real compassion is about showing up for people when they need you most, regardless of the personal cost. 27 years after Diana's death, homelessness remains a critical issue in cities around the world. But her legacy lives on in every person who chooses to see homeless individuals as human beings rather than problems, in every volunteer who sits down to have a real conversation rather than just serving food, and in every policymaker who remembers that behind every statistic is a person with a name, a story, and inherent dignity. The young men Diana met during her secret missions, Vincent, Marcus, and Ricky, all went on to rebuild their lives, inspired partly by the medical care and housing support they received, but perhaps more importantly by the experience of being treated with genuine respect by someone who had no obligation to care about them. But Diana's story challenges all of us to ask difficult questions. How many homeless people do we walk past without making eye contact? How many opportunities do we miss to treat society's most vulnerable people with the dignity they deserve? How often do we choose comfort over compassion, convenience over connection? If Princess Diana's secret acts of courage inspire you to see homeless people differently, to volunteer at local shelters, or simply to make eye contact and acknowledge the humanity of people society has forgotten, please share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to honor Diana's legacy and the reminder that we all have the power to make invisible people visible through the simple act of treating them with respect. Because Diana's greatest secret wasn't that she snuck out at night to feed the homeless. Her greatest secret was that she understood something most people never learn. The most powerful thing any of us can do is remind another human being that they matter. And that's a secret that could change the world, one conversation at a time. Don't let Princess Diana's compassion be just a story you watch. Let it be an example you follow. Because somewhere in your community tonight, there's someone like Vincent, Marcus, or Ricky who needs to be reminded that they're not invisible, that they're not disposable, and that they matter more than they know.